This PowerPoint is going to go over population ecology as a whole. It's going to be split up into two. When I get into aquatic systems, I'll stop recording at that point and then look for population ecology 2. This recording is called population ecology 1. Now, some of the things to keep in mind throughout this presentation. Genetic variation, mutations, and environmental factors contribute to the diversity of organisms or their extinction. We call that population density within a particular ecosystem. So we need to think of how genetic variation, mutations, and environmental factors are going to play a role in that. Limiting factors are also very important throughout all this. It's a very, very important term. Food, shelter, water, space, those are just some examples of limiting factors. Now, limiting factors can have an impact on a species throughout an ecosystem. So it's also very important to understand how that can occur as well, and we'll go through some of those as well. All right, some factors that affect the population growth. We have density-dependent factors and density-independent. Very simple to understand. Density-dependent factors are...
sorry for the interruption, please.
So as I was saying, density-dependent factors are factors that are basically dependent upon the density. So in other words, it would have a role on the growth of a population, but that role would be directly attributed in some way to the population, or rather the number of the population. Competition, for example, that's density dependent, because if competition is high, that means there are too many organisms competing for food, and so therefore the density of the population is going to play a role in whether that population can successfully grow or not. Predation, the act of predator-prey relationship, is going to have an effect, or is going to be affected by the density of the population, how many there are in that population. We remember, and it's coming up in a slide or so, remember the chart where when the population of the prey goes up, the population of the predator will also go up, and that would bring the population of the prey down, which in turn would then bring the population of the predator down, and it just keeps zigzagging, up, up, down, down, up, up. One follows the other. That's obviously clearly dependent upon the density. Parasitism, disease, food supply, these are all density-dependent factors, because when disease goes up, obviously many times it can be attributed to overpopulations. Parasitism as well. Food supply would be affected by overpopulations or underpopulations as well. And then we have density-independent factors. The biggest ones there are natural disasters. When the population of an organism goes down, say for example because of a storm, that had nothing to do with how much competition there was. That had nothing to do with predator-prey relationships. That had to do with the fact that a natural disaster, flooding, earthquake, hurricane, comes in and basically wipes out 30, 40, 50, 60% of a population. So when that number of that population went down, it was because of a storm, not because the population became overpopulated or anything like that. Environmental changes, we go in, we cut down trees, we wipe out an area. We can affect the population of organisms by taking away their space, their shelter. Human activities, we had a huge population a huge problem back in the 70s with DDT. Fertilizing with DDT would make its way into our water streams. Fish would eat it. Birds, large predatory birds, would eat these fish. It would have an adverse effect on their population because DDT wouldn't allow these birds to have or to produce a proper eggshell. And so these birds were unable to produce offspring because the eggs would not produce the hard shell, and they would not be able to produce as many young. We're talking about eagles, falcons, large predatory birds. Now, in the case of the eagle, that became a problem. It's a protected bird. And that was attributed to the fertilization caused by us, human activity. Removal of predators. We think sometimes we're doing a good thing, but we've learned that sometimes we just need to take a step back and let nature take its own course. You guys every once in a while ask me when I put on a video and you see an animal come into danger, why the cameraman didn't get involved simply by picking up the bird and putting it back into its nest. Sometimes we need to take a step back and just let nature take its course. Because when we do that, yeah, we might be saving that bird, but that bird could have been a food supply for another animal. And we cannot go based on, well, we're only going to save the ones that are cute, but the ones that are not as attractive, we won't save. So we can't think that way. So anyway, those are the differences between density-dependent factors and density-independent. These factors would have an effect on the growth of a population, but have nothing to do with the density of the population, the number of the population. Here's that chart that I was telling you about, and density dependent. And the population of prey go up, the population of predator is also go up. The population of prey goes down, the population of predator goes down as well. So density-dependent factors, predator-prey relationships, competition is also going to, which is kind of related to this as well. Competition is going to have an effect on it. And like I said earlier, density-independent factors are factors like lack of water. It's going to affect the population of plant life. It'll affect the population, obviously, of whatever other living organisms are dependent upon, not just the water itself, but even the plants that survive from the water. Fire, flooding, pollution is a density-independent factor as well. All these, again, affect the population, but not directly because of the population itself, like predator-prey relationships. Now we have two modes of population growth. We have our exponential and we have our logistic. The biggest difference, the one thing that I want you to get from this, exponential lacks a carrying capacity. You see, exponential will continue and it will just grow. I hate to use the word uncontrollably, but for the most part, that's basically what it's kind of implying there. Carrying capacity is like a limit. So carrying capacity, once carrying capacity is reached, the growth rate will slow down. And once it slows down, it will basically taper off, and stay. Basically, that environment has reached its carrying capacity, meaning that birth rate and death rate will kind of equal each other out here. The environment reaches its carrying capacity, its limit. It cannot withstand, due to limits of space and food, competition, things like that. It cannot hold any more than that. So once carrying capacity is reached, that's it. Whatever number would be reached here, that would be basically, with a standard deviation plus or minus of whatever, depending on how much we're talking about, that would be how much it could hold there. Say, for example, large predatory birds could have a carrying capacity of approximately 50. That means that in that ecosystem, if it's going to be 50 plus or minus, say, probably 3 or 4, something like that. Exponential, we would see this grow, and obviously at some point in time, once this excessively exceeds its carrying capacity, nature will find a way to kind of balance this out as well. Something will happen to the population size to kind of slow it down or bring it back down. In some cases, like with us, for example, it would be a drastic change. Like the Black Plague brought our exponential growth down drastically, rather rapidly. There are 4 big factors that affect the growth of a population: birth rate, death rate, immigration rate, and emigration rate. Immigration rate and emigration rate is the coming in and going out of an ecosystem, and birth rate and death rate, how many are born versus how many are dying within a given period of time. We typically don't do this per day. We typically do this in a longer period of sometimes per month, sometimes per year. It all basically pretty much depends on what organism we're talking about. So, other factors that could affect on that would be economic factors. Economic recession could have a consequence. A loss of jobs is going to decrease the growth of a population. When there's a lack of money, sometimes certain individuals would be more susceptible to withhold on family planning, and they say, no, now might not be a good time to get pregnant and have kids, because being out of work, you're going to wonder, where am I going to get the money to pay medical bills and so forth. Higher status of women. Women long ago used to get married and start a family at a much younger age. But now today, in the course of the last 20, 30 years, women have become much more independent, and they want to basically take care of their own career first before sometimes not only getting married, but also, in terms of family planning as well. So that could in turn have a decrease of population, but their higher status also allows women to earn more money than what they used to, and that would have an increase of population. Educational attainment. If individuals are getting a lower socioeconomic status due to a loss of education, ironically enough, that actually increases the population in many areas. It kind of contradicts the very first one of loss of jobs, but it's sometimes people say, well, this is the way life is going to be, and I didn't, college wasn't quite for me, and so they end up many times in areas like that. You see an increase of population. Government standards have an effect on population as well, as do the ability of providing adequate health care. Both of those have a negative effect on population growth. They decrease population growths. So limiting factors could be either density dependent, excuse me, like competition, predation, predator-prey relationships, and parasitism and disease. The spread of a parasite or a disease can definitely affect the growth of a population. And then we have density independent factors, factors that really won't have an effect or rather won't be attributed to the number of the population, and the number of the population won't determine whether the population can grow or not. We can see these as human disturbances, like us wiping out an area, natural disasters, and unusual weather, long drought, for example, something like that. Other factors like economic recession, level of education, higher status for females, medical care, and so forth, even government restrictions, things like that. We have our modes of population growth, our logistic and our exponential. All right, let's go through a couple of questions here. By the way, I want to make sure that we understand. So I want to go back for a second. We'll go back to the question real quick, but I did want to go back. Where is it? Here. Birth rate and death rate, it's important to understand that. Birth rate versus death rate talks about how many die versus how many are born. In terms of plant, for example, plants do this very well. Plants occupy a particular amount of space, and so their birth rate goes up. And then when their birth rate goes up and they realize that space is kind of running out, they'll slow down that birth rate. Okay? Now, not to say that death rate is going to balance it out, but to a certain degree, it kind of does. Because the death rate of a plant, when space starts to become limited, plants can start to basically reach that carrying capacity and start to slow birth rate down and equal death rate. In terms of animals, for example, we go back to natural selection. We go back to the strongest surviving. When two die, then somewhere two will be born. And that number is always going to pretty much balance itself out. Immigration, animals coming in to an area, can raise predation, competition, things like that. That's going to have an effect, a negative effect on the population growth. So then we would see emigration, organisms and animals leaving a particular area is going to bring down the population number, which would lower competition and things like that. But those two, what I want to point out is they have a direct correlation with each other. Birth rate goes directly with death rate, and immigration coming in goes directly or is directly linked to emigration. Obviously, when an organism is emigrating from one location, it's going to be doing what? It's going to be immigrating in another. Okay, so there's another correlation there. Let me just kind of speed through this again. Okay, so let's go through a couple of questions here. In the survivorship curve here, the probability of an individual in this population surviving to 8 years is just about what? We're at 8 years here. So what do you approximate the percentage being? we see the curve doing what? As the older the animal gets, the curve is going what? Down. So therefore, we can knock out 100%, right? What do we think it's going to be? It's going to be E 20%. We're almost to that end right about there, meaning life expectancy of this animal is probably anywhere of about 10 years old, around there. As the population gets larger, density dependent factors are blank and density independent factors are blank. We would say that as the population gets larger, our density dependent factors, first of all, would we say they are unaffected? So we can take A and E out. Now, would they diminish? Probably not. So we're going to go with intensify, where our density independent factors are what? All right, so now do our density independent factors diminish or are unaffected as the population gets larger? Because of the fact that they're density independent, that means that they're basically unaffected. And the value of this carrying capacity, the population described by the growth curve below, is what? What would be the value? Obviously, what this question is basically testing is that you understand carrying capacity as being this location of the curve right here. It's where the curve no longer increases and doesn't really show a big decrease either. It just basically slows down and then stays equal. So if you come across, we are where? At about 4,000 right there. Okay? All right. You can go through the self-check here of what determines how large a population can grow. So what are some of the things that can determine how large a population can grow? Are limiting factors: living space, competition, predation, diseases. Those are the things that can determine how large a population is going to be able to grow. Density dependent limiting factors, how those can affect the carrying capacity. Well, obviously space availability is going to be a big one, and food availability. When space starts to run out and food starts to run out, then carrying capacity will be met. How do density independent limiting factors affect a population growth? Well, when we have limiting factors that are density independent, natural disasters are going to be a limiting factor that have nothing to do with the density of the population. They are going to obviously have an effect on how well that population is going to grow, especially when they're all wiped out in one shot, a major storm or something like that. All right, at this point, the PowerPoint talks a little bit about aquatic systems. So Population Ecology 1 will stop at this point. For the rest of this PowerPoint, look for the video on Population Ecology 2.